how do you make a successful MMO? That's a question that's been pondering my mind a bit recently, given all the recent changes with the MMO scene. World of Warcraft losing its popularity, Final Fantasy now taking the placement as king of MMOs. I've been wondering many questions like, how would you keep an MMO relevant in nowadays? And what are the factors that make an MMO so successful? After looking into this topic and using my own sort of personal research and opinions on these questions from the games I've played, I thought it'd be interesting to make a video given sort of what I think are the answers to these questions from my point of view. So if you end up enjoying this video, remember to like and subscribe, and I'd be really interested to see what your guys' opinions are in the comments below. So, getting into this video. What is an MMO anyway? Well, an MMO, it's a massive multiplayer online game designed to have many people playing it at once. Its origins can be traced back to the 1980s. Multi-user dungeon games like Island of Kesme is where MMOs started. MMOs tend to draw inspiration from pre-existing IPs like D&D, but a lot of them make their own unique world settings that players have grown to love. It was in the 1990s that the MMO genre started to have a massive boom of popularity. 3 games known as the Big Three were Ultima Online, Asheron's Call, and EverQuest. These games, they're competition with each other, set up for modern days MMOs, especially EverQuest. It is sort of the foundation that WoW built itself upon. Now that you have a bit of background to what MMOs were or are, I'm going to talk about 3 MMOs that I have some experience with playing: Final Fantasy XIV, World of Warcraft, and Star Wars: The Republic. I'm going to give these MMOs as examples to try and explain my points on successful MMOs, failed MMOs, and MMOs that have sort of bounced back. World of Warcraft can be considered one of the most successful MMOs of all time, and has dominated the MMO genre for almost 2 decades now. It's only of recent that Final Fantasy has finally taken over WoW's popularity due to a multiple of reasons, such as WoW's poor development cycle, its relationship with fans getting worse and worse, and of course the recent California lawsuit, meaning that people don't want to necessarily support Activision Blizzard. Now, I myself have played World of Warcraft for hundreds, if not thousands of hours, and I love the game due to the experiences I've had in it, the memories I have from it. And I mean, on this channel, that is one of the first series was me and my friends playing World of Warcraft. But for the purpose of this video, I will be explaining World of Warcraft in terms of a successful MMO, despite I know it has many flaws and its current outlook seeming quite grim. Now, WoW was able to build its success on the fact that it was trying to do what already existed but better. It was considered easier to play and less punishing than the other MMOs at the time, which made it more accessible to the less hardcore players. And MMOs thrive when it has accessibility. WoW to this day still uses the subscription format as a payment method, which I consider very outdated, just considering the fact that people have to pay so many monthly payments such as streaming services, phone bills, and asking for money for a video game, having to pay for time is a hard sell, but WoW still is able to do it. I mean, other MMOs also try and do subscription format. Some fail, some succeed. Final Fantasy XIV has done well with subscription, but many have to move to free-to-play or buy-to-play. Guild Wars 2 has done fine with buy-to-play systems. WoW has had 8 expansions so far during its lifetime, which has given it a plethora of content and collectibles that can keep players busy, and as well as adding new patches of gameplay for players to come back for and deem it worth paying that sub price once again. WoW's most recent expansion, Shadowlands, sold 3.7 million copies worldwide at launch. The Warcraft franchise has made millions for Blizzard over the years, and it has a dedicated fan base that has purchased movie tickets, clothes, books, all by the bucket load. Also, considering, given the fact that when an MMO is coming out that seems promising, it is typically dubbed a WoW killer, just goes to show the infamy that WoW has within the MMO genre. A factor of WoW's consistent popularity over its long lifetime is due to many aspects such as its extensive lore and in-depth world building that gives something for fans to be invested into. Entire YouTube channels are dedicated just to WoW's lore alone, like Noble87. Another reason, which will sound a little bit like a joke to you guys, is the game's graphics. Now I know WoW does have awful graphics by today's standards, but considering the age of the game, it holds up alright. Many games that went for a more realistic art style back in 2004 now look extremely outdated and seem awful compared to modern day standards, whereas WoW's artistic, cartoony style is aged slightly better. By all means, maybe it could be, improved, but it has aged more gracefully. A more recent factor for WoW's success, of course, is its classic version, the vanilla base edition of the game, how it was back in 2004. Now, although I do question how Activision deems is the original version of the game, Classic has been a smash success, with players who are old veterans coming back to the game after they fell out of love due to its many expansions and changes. Classic WoW revitalized the game, as nostalgia sells extremely well, and is proven in WoW's subscription numbers were tripled due to Classic WoW. WoW as of date has had a bit of a tumble as of recent, but it was still considered a giant in the industry. And although it's maybe caused players to be more recently frustrated with its complex features, and maybe they haven't listened to fans' feedback, WoW is a pinnacle of an MMO, and is what many MMOs strive to be. The points to take away from WoW is that it is a perfect example of building upon what existed and doing it better. It has tons of rewarding and engaging content, such as its high-end PvE and PvP content, and the fact that they keep adding more and more for players to come back and do is a great basis that all MMOs should try to replicate to some degree. Now, moving on to Star Wars The Republic. It's a tragic story of what should have been one of the biggest MMOs of all time, but wasn't. An MMO based in the Star Wars universe should have been a guaranteed success, and it should have soared beyond the heights of WoW, and stayed with a longevity for many, many, many years. SWTOR, as it's typically dubbed, was developed by BioWare, and the game cost $200 million, which even by today's standards is a lot of money for a game. It was meant to continue the story of the beloved Knights of the Old Republic that already had a fan base, and Star Wars The Republic was not the first Star Wars MMO. That was Star Wars Galaxies, which did rather well, meaning that there were people that were very interested when SWTOR was coming out, and it had a lot to live up to. And as we've seen with the Disney's recent installments to the Star Wars franchise, Star Wars fans have a very strong opinion on what they think makes Star Wars so good, meaning that SWTOR had to get it right. Now, SWTOR did not do well. It wasn't that it was inherently bad or poorly made. It had a good story and an interesting narrative, but it just lacked substantial content and did nothing new compared to its rival MMOs. Many people, including myself, found questing boring. I found the features were dull, and I didn't enjoy what I would thought would be amazing aspects of the game, such as spaceship fights. It just felt repetitive. Now, I haven't played SWTOR as of recent, and I am aware that other MMOs, like WoW, have its own fair share of boring questing and nullified features, but the fact is that WoW was already on the market. It already had the players' investments. When SWTOR was the new kid on the block, it needed something that was a unique selling point and would rope people into playing it. And having the Star Wars brand isn't enough when it comes to people's subscription money and investing that much time into an MMO. You have to put lots and lots of hours to make that amount of progress again in a different MMO than you had in previous MMOs. For instance, when I think of Star Wars, I think of large-scale spaceship battles, exploring far-off planets with strange and wonderful ecosystems, and of course, dramatic lightsaber battles. SWTOR, in my opinion, and it seems to the opinion of many, did not deliver on any of these aspects in any meaningful way. Planets were a small instance of hallways, and spaceship battles were a boring on-rail shooter. I think this is where SWTOR went wrong. It tried to be too much like WoW in terms of art style, was cartoony rather than more realistic or trying to be its own style. And the game just focused too much on generic tab target combat. It picked very sort of maybe not very interesting class archetypes. And it's really why the game didn't stand out enough. I mean, lightsaber battling lends itself so well to an action-oriented combat system. Why would you pick tab targeting? With all that being said, SWTOR, to my understanding, is completely redeemable, and I believe it's now accepted as a more sort of single-player story MMO, if it can still be deemed an MMO. But for the purpose of providing an argument for a failed MMO, SWTOR just didn't hit the mark. My final example for providing the argument of what is needed to make a successful MMO and how you can keep it relevant is Final Fantasy XIV, a story of triumph in the face of defeat, proving that with determination and listening to your fans' feedback and a lot of money, you can bring an MMO back from the brink of failure. Final Fantasy XIV, of course, is the 14th installment in the hit Final Fantasy series. And similar to Star Wars: The Republic, it would not be the first Final Fantasy MMO. Final Fantasy XI came before it. Now, Final Fantasy XIV was very poorly received on release. It was panned by critics due to many factors such as the awful UI and the terrible system of leveling and hindering you, and the fact that there was just nothing fun to do in the game. It was completely evident that the developers completely just misunderstood what an MMO was meant to be. They focused entirely on graphics, and that meant that only high-end PCs at the time could run it without performance issues. This meant that it was harder to have that wider spread accessibility, which is what's so important for an MMO. Now, Square Enix did pull the plug on Final Fantasy XIV after 2 years, and they would announce that they were going to be remaking it. The developers would listen to the issues the fans raised and would build on the game and improve it. The original version of Final Fantasy XIV would be known as 1.0. And this version, with the weak story and the no player direction, would be used as a basis for the new version, 2.0, or better known as A Realm Reborn. This would have the core iconic features of Final Fantasy, epic storytelling, and that fantasy world that we love so much from the series would be evident within the world, more importantly. Now, 2.0 would build a great story based within 1.0's catastrophic end, which I think is a great idea. They would work on the gameplay systems, completely overhaul the terrible UI, and turn it into an entirely different game. 2.0 would become now what is one of the biggest MMOs. Part of the reason for Final Fantasy's success now, and I believe the reason they were able to turn such a failure into such success, is due to their new leader, Yoshi P. He, ironically, got the Final Fantasy developers to play World of Warcraft and learn from it. And I think that's a good example of making sure you understand your competition the same way that WoW did long ago. And I think it's partly the reason that Final Fantasy has done so well now. It knew what it needed to do to be better, and it also knew what it had to do better than its competition. On top of that, I also think that building a good relationship with the fans is why Final Fantasy did so well. Listening to what they had to say and respecting their opinions builds a good relationship between developers and fans that makes them loyal to you. Another factor is that Final Fantasy Realm Reborn would work on many of its performance issues, meaning that lower spec hardware could play Final Fantasy XIV. This gave the game the much needed accessibility to a wider audience that could not afford these high-end computers at the time. Final Fantasy XIV's revival is a rare one, and it is an example that an MMO can be saved with the right commitment, finances, and an understanding of what is the problem and what is the solution. With Final Fantasy XIV becoming one of the largest MMOs at current, it might be time for World of Warcraft to take a leaf out of Final Fantasy's book and consider changing things up drastically to improve it. Now, I have given some examples of MMOs I deem are successes, failures, and MMOs that have learned from their failures to become successes. So, what have I understood from this? And what am I trying to help you guys try and understand from this? Well, all in all, to make it a successful MMO, you want to build a loyal fan base that builds a good relationship between developers and players. Make sure you're listening to their opinions. You also want to make sure you have a unique selling point that stands out from other MMOs. Otherwise, you'll have nothing that attracts the players from what they're already on. Making sure you provide consistent content that is engaging or at least rewarding and feels worthwhile for the players, so that it doesn't feel like a stagnated MMO with nothing to do. And of course, if you are making an MMO with an existing IP, make sure you manage expectations. You don't want your players on launch to try your game and be disappointed, thinking it was going to be something completely different to what it was. A prime example of a game just overselling itself is Cyberpunk. Now, of course, that's not an MMO, but that is a great example of not managing expectations with your players. If you do reach for the stars for an MMO, make sure that you have the funds for if it fails. If you know that your MMO is not doing well, you need to make sure that you have the development team and the money to fix the fundamental issues of your game. And I do think any MMO can be saved if given the right amount of time, money, and man hours. Now, to give an example of an MMO that I think maybe fulfills this criteria would be Ashes of Creation by Intrepid Studios. Although it's still currently in development, I think it has a lot of promise. And of course, I'm keeping my expectations reasonable. I do think that it does listen to the player feedback. I do think it has a lot of unique selling points that are interesting. I think will be really cool to see an MMO have. And I generally think it could be a smash success on release if it follows through on everything it says it's going to do. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you tell me in the comments if you have. And again, I'd like to hear from you guys and what you think about this type of content. And make sure you check out any other videos in the channel if you're interested. And until next time, guys, see ya.